This is Unit 9.9, Endangered Species. Species can become endangered through any number of causes. First, we're going to look at natural causes for endangerment. So species can starve, right? They can be outcompeted by other species. They could be preyed on excessively by other species. They could be killed through natural disasters. And maybe you're thinking of the dinosaurs, right? That caused the meteor that hit the Earth caused dinosaurs to go extinct, but that was considered a natural disaster. It's possible for habitat to be lost through natural means. Think of hurricanes or volcanic eruptions can destroy habitat naturally. Um, Also, impediments to mating. So populations that could be separated due to, let's say, flooding in a river, or if you're talking about a long enough period of time, like continents splitting apart and oceans coming between different populations, some species could go extinct this way. There are also causes of endangerment that are caused by humans. And so there's a fun little acronym called HIPCO, and these are six human causes of endangerment. So habitat destruction, which also includes habitat degradation or habitat fragmentation, can cause species to become endangered. Invasive species, right, which we learned are caused by humans, can result in native species becoming endangered. Pollution, which is caused by humans, can negatively affect plant or animal populations. Finally, population growth, really human population growth, which can result in habitat destruction as humans create more space for themselves to live. Climate change is a known cause of endangerment by changing the living conditions that animals or plants are in, making them less habitable by taking them out of their zone of tolerance. And finally, overexploitation, which we'll cover more in chapter 5, but includes overhunting, right? Applies a lot to fish populations in the ocean. Overharvesting, such as cutting down too many trees. Oh, and overfishing. There, I don't know why that's not included in overhunting, but there it is. So, what makes species especially prone to endangerment or extinction? Like, what are behaviors or characteristics that make them likely to become endangered? So, low reproductive rates. Animals with low reproductive rates tend to become endangered. Right, pandas are a good example of that. Animals that have very specialized niches, if those niches disappear or shrink, then those animals can become endangered. Narrow distributions of animals, right, that only live in small areas. If those areas are affected by pollution or other anthropogenic sources, then they may go extinct. Animals that feed at very high trophic levels, so they tend to be affected very much by changes in the populations of animals below them, and so they can go extinct very easily or become endangered very easily. Animals that have fixed migratory patterns, if there's some sort of change that prevents them from doing their regular migration route, that can then cause them to become endangered. Species that are rare, there just aren't very many of them. If a lot of them were to die off at one time, that could make the species endangered. Some animals that are commercially valuable will become endangered due to overhunting. And then animals with very large territories, like condors or grizzly bears, when their territory becomes fragmented, then they're not able to survive. Selective pressures are factors that change behaviors and fitness of organisms within their environment. So we call them selective because they tend to be associated with natural selection. And when species are naturally selected, then they will evolve to meet changes in their environment. So as we're going to see, factors that are density dependent, such as predators, which like high densities of prey, shelter or water, tend to have species or individuals cluster around them. Food sources are a density dependent factor where individuals will cluster around those food sources. Diseases tend to happen more in densely packed populations, and accumulation of wastes. If they if waste accumulates in a specific place, then that makes that place less habitable. And so these are all factors that will lead to changes in species, hence they are selective pressures. Some density independent factors are things like natural disasters, like I said, hurricanes or volcanic eruptions, for example. Um, Changes in abiotic factors, right? Temperature, the Earth is warming, and that is causing species to have to migrate or die, right? They are becoming endangered. Weather conditions can also affect species independently of how they're distributed. But not all species are equally impacted by these pressures and these changes, and this depends on their adaptability. Right, animals that tend to be generalists, omnivores, can adapt pretty quickly if they reproduce quickly. Then there may be species that have mutations which allow them to survive in these changed conditions. And then mobility also. So animals that are more mobile um, can adapt to changing conditions. Right, plants are basically immobile and can have a lot of difficulty adapting to changing conditions. So, how do we protect species that become endangered? One way is to criminalize poaching. And so, this is a major challenge because so many endangered species live in countries that have difficulty stopping poachers. We can also protect endangered species by protecting animal habitats, right? So the habitats where endangered animals live can be protected. So we find ways to create like conservation lots or plans for conservation. And a lot of these lands depend on having the right size, shape, and connectedness in order to make them habitable for animals. So we're talking about the theory of island biogeography, menopopulations, um, single large habitats or several small habitats, and also what happens with edge habitats. The theory of island biogeography, and we are going to come back to this, um, shows that island size and distance from mainland uh, determines the biodiversity of those islands. So consider an island that is very small is going to have fewer species because there are fewer resources, and these islands that are far from the mainland will also have fewer species because it's harder for the individuals to get there. This is contrasted with large islands, which have lots of resources and can therefore support many more species, and islands that are nearby to the mainland, so the species are able to migrate to those islands more easily. So if you look at this graph, the horizontal axis shows species richness, like how many species are present on an island. And islands that are large and nearby tend to have more species. Islands that are small and distant from the mainland tend to have fewer species. And then somewhere in between, if you look at the top intersection between small islands and close to mainland, and then the bottom intersection of large islands far from the mainland, those tend to be closer in their species richness to each other because they have these contrasting characteristics of the island, of the location and the size of the island. If you didn't realize this already, you should copy this graph down into your notebook and learn it well. So I would suggest pausing the video here and copying this down before you continue. So metapopulations are populations that have been spatially separated, even though they're of the same species, and they can interact and interbreed, even though they have different habitats, right? So if you have islands that are close together, you'll often see populations of similar species, but spread out across these islands. if you consider the size and number of habitats, that also helps determine whether species become endangered. So consider the size of reserve, right? A larger reserve is better than a smaller one, right? More habitat space is better than small habitat space. Similarly, for the number of reserves, we'd rather have one large connected reserve than several smaller reserves that were the same area. How close these reserves are to each other, right? So if you have multiple reserves, it's better if they're close to each other than if they're far apart. Whether the reserves are connected. So you might have several reserves and they're connected by small corridors, and that's better than unconnected reserves. As we'll see in a later slide or a later screencast, highways tend to cause fragmentation of habitat. And so there are lots of places where they're building overpasses and underpasses that animals can get through or around the highways safely, and therefore increase the connectivity of their habitats. The reserve shape is important also, right? It's better to have a compact shape than a irregular or lengthy shape, so the boundaries are not too long. And then finally, best reserves have buffer zones. This allows some space between the animals that we're trying to protect and humans that are destroying their habitat. Finally, edge effects. So edge effects are habitats that are subjected to conditions outside of the habitat. And so it may be difficult for plants or animals to survive on the edges as well as they would if they were on the interior of a habitat. So this is one of the reasons why larger, more compact reserves are better. So if you look at the large square on the left, the amount that's affected by edge effects is only 30% of the reserve. But as you make the reserve smaller, each time you make it smaller, that increases the percentage of the reserve that's affected by edge effects until finally you get to the far right where you have this little tiny reserve and there's more edge effects than there are effects of the reserve. A lot of biosphere reserves contain zones that there's some allowed amount of impact. For example, continually hear maybe every couple of years about oil companies trying to drill in ANWR, which is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. And so in certain areas of Alaska, even though it's federal land, some oil companies are allowed to drill up there. But ANWR so far has been left pristine. So some biosphere reserves allow impact, but some do not. Consider this one, the Kasuko National Park. It has a core where there is no development allowed, and then there's a buffer zone where some impact is allowed. Another way to protect species is through legislation. There are many examples of protecting species, individual species, through legislation. This is a traditional option where people become experts on important species, allowing governments or nonprofit organizations to focus their money and their resources and efforts on protecting a specific species. Some examples of this, like the California condor, was an endangered species, but bred in captivity and then reintroduced to its habitat. The habitat or the population had crashed due to poaching and lead poisoning, and of course habitat destruction. By 1987, all the remaining wild condors, of which there were only 27, were captured. They were bred in captivity and reintroduced, and now there's 400 to 500. So fairly successful program there. So how do we decide which species, individual species, deserve this amount of attention? So in indicator species, right, which indicate the health of environments, any sort of flagship or charismatic species, umbrella species, keystone species all tend to get this kind of attention. Deserve is a pretty loaded term. What does it mean to deserve this kind of protection? So animals that quickly reflect changes in ecosystem functioning, right? Those are indicator species. We protect keystone species because they have disproportionate far-reaching impacts on other species in the ecosystem. Flagship species tend to be popular with humans, which makes them easier to protect. Think pandas, right? Charismatic species, things like gorillas tend to raise concern and awareness. And then finally, umbrella species, like if you protect and conserve one species, it indirectly conserves and protects other species within their ecosystem. Slightly different than the keystone species, where that keystone species actually affects the ecosystem, where the umbrella species benefits to other species in the ecosystem is just a fortunate side effect. Right, so here's some examples, right? Certain frogs are good indicator species. Umbrella species, you protect redwoods, you protect everything that lives in the redwood forests as well. And then charismatic species, right? Certain types of monkeys or gorillas, sea otters are super cute. They make good candidates for deserving protection. And of course, keystone species. So coming up with a good example of keystone species would be helpful, of course. Certain megafauna tend to be very charismatic, right? These are things that we tend to see in zoos: zebras, tigers, giraffes. Keep coming back to pandas, right? These are animals that people like to look at, and people like to protect them. There are, of course, limitations to this approach. It'd be better if we could protect the habitat of these creatures. So, we talk about protecting pandas, but what we really need to do is protect the habitat that the pandas live in. And that would allow the pandas to live and grow however they're supposed to, as opposed to trying to just treat the pandas themselves. Another good reason to protect habitat is there's species out there that we don't know of, relationships that we haven't observed. And so if we protect the habitat, then we protect things that we don't even know exist, which of course is helpful. And then if we protect habitat, then we can focus money and effort on hotspots, biodiversity, things like rainforests and coral reefs, where biodiversity is very high and therefore in some ways more deserving of protection than places where biodiversity is not as high. Some more examples of legislation: the Marine Mammal Protection Act prohibited killing any marine mammals in the U.S. and exporting their body parts. Endangered Species Act of 1973 authorized the Fish and Wildlife Service to determine species that were listed as threatened or endangered and prohibited their harm, as well as trading for their body parts. So species that are endangered may be extinct within the foreseeable future. That's why they're listed as endangered. So this map has some examples, and you can see where a lot of these species exist. 10 species countries that are pretty highly developed. So the United States, Mexico, Spain, India, China, Indonesia, so forth. Notice that a lot of the endangered species tend to be clustered in specific places in the US. The next step down are threatened species, which are likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So notice here as well, you see a high number of species in places like China, India, Australia, Brazil, all being listed as threatened. So here's an interesting issue because this has been happening recently. All these animals were saved by the Endangered Species Act. And so some people argue that some of these species should be taken off the endangered species list. But one problem that has happened is that if a species comes off the federal endangered species list, then states are allowed to implement whatever laws or regulations they want to, or lack thereof, regarding these species. One issue that's been happening recently is that gray wolves were taken off the endangered species list, only listed as threatened. And the number of wolves that were being killed by hunters and poachers in Montana and Wyoming went way, way up, because there were no restrictions on them hunting the wolves anymore. And so why should we care if species become extinct? Well, as we saw before, systems with higher biodiversity tend to be resistant to change. So we want to preserve these species, so that as the climate changes, those ecosystems are more likely to survive. Some of the value that species provide, right? Goods and services, recreation, aesthetics. Some of these species we just like looking at. They may also provide the basis for certain medicine or research, and really genetic information that we're doing science on, like what the genetics of these species are, helps inform our knowledge of the Earth. The intrinsic value of species is the right to exist regardless of practical use. So the extrinsic value means we have some use for it, but maybe a lot of people believe that these species have intrinsic value. This was naturalist E.O. Wilson. The biophilia, that we feel inherent genetic kinship with the natural world. You can consider that for things like gorillas and monkeys, where they're primates similar to us. So we feel more affiliated to those types of animals. All right, that's Unit 9.9. Let me know if you have any questions.